African art's influence on modernism, the hidden blueprint. What if the revolutionary art movements of the early 20th century weren't simply born in Europe? What if the roots of Cubism, Fauvism, and Primitivism reached deep into Africa's artistic heritage? Today on Echoes of Africa, we're uncovering the truth behind how African art reshaped Western aesthetics and changed the course of modern art forever. To understand the profound influence of African art on modernism, we must first immerse ourselves in the world it was about to disrupt, the European art scene of the late 19th century. This was an era dominated by the academies, powerful institutions that dictated artistic taste and success. The annual Paris Salon was the ultimate arbiter, a grand stage where careers were made or broken. Here, a very specific kind of art reigned supreme. Academic painting was the gold standard, meticulously realistic, strictly representational, and bound by the ironclad rules of linear perspective, precise anatomy, and classical Greco-Roman ideals of beauty. The goal was a polished, almost photographic illusion of reality, often depicting historical epics, mythological tales, or portraits of the elite. It was a tradition that valued technical perfection above all else, a system that had held sway for centuries. But beneath this veneer of stability, a current of restlessness was growing. By the turn of the century, many European artists felt creatively suffocated. The rise of photography had challenged painting's primary role as a documenter of reality. What was the purpose of painstakingly recreating a scene when a camera could capture it in an instant? This technological shift, coupled with a broader societal questioning of old certainties, left artists feeling constrained by the Academy's rigid doctrines. They were yearning for new forms of expression, for a visual language that could convey emotion and psychology, not just surface appearance. They were searching for new ways of seeing. Enter the avant-garde, small, defiant groups of artists ready to shatter the rules. And it is into this space of radical openness, intense curiosity, and artistic disruption that African art enters the European story. These objects began arriving in Europe not as art, but as artifacts, trophies of colonial expansion. They were displayed in ethnographic museums and world's fairs, presented as curiosities from so-called primitive cultures. But for the artists of the avant-garde, these objects were not curiosities. They were revelations. They offered a powerful alternative to the tired conventions of Western naturalism. It is crucial to understand that African artistic traditions are far from monolithic. The term African art itself is a vast oversimplification. Across the continent for millennia, countless distinct cultures have produced their own sophisticated visual systems. Each has its own unique aesthetic principles, symbolic motifs, and preferred materials. Consider the elongated, serene forms of Fang reliquary figures from Gabon, the complex cosmology embedded in the masks of the Dogon people of Mali, or the refined elegance of Bolé portrait masks from Côte d'Ivoire. These were not objects made for galleries. They were vital parts of community life, masks used in masquerades to connect with ancestral spirits, sculptures that served as conduits for spiritual forces, and textiles whose patterns encoded histories and proverbs. They were objects of power, function, and profound meaning. But one feature stands out. Many of these works use abstraction, stylization, and geometry, not simply to imitate nature, but to express spiritual, social, and cosmological ideas. For example, the mask from the Fang people of Gabon, the Mbete reliquary figures, the Dogon sculpture traditions, each shows a bold reduction of human form into rhythmic planes, tension between positive and negative space, and an inherent logic of design. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. A study of modernist movements recognizes how European avant-garde artists observed this sophistication. Researchers note, modernist artists were drawn to African sculpture because of its sophisticated approach to the abstraction of the human figure. How did African art reach Europe, and how did European artists respond? During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, through colonial expansion, trade, and ethnographic exhibitions, African artifacts began appearing in European museums and private collections. At the same time, European avant-garde artists visited ethnographic museums and became fascinated. A key moment, Picasso's visit to the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro in Paris, is often cited as a turning point. He is reputed to have said, when confronted with African masks and objects, that he finally understood what painting was about. The influence of these forms can be seen in his 1907 painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Scholars argue that the infusion of African forms into European modernism was much more than superficial appropriation. It challenged the very foundations of representation. Abstract instead of mimetic, spiritual instead of literal. Recent research corroborates this. A 2023 paper titled The Influence of African Art on Modernist Artists shows that European artists incorporated African-inspired elements not just for novelty, but to question how art could represent the human form and space itself. So how exactly did African art influence modernist practices? To understand the depth of this connection, we first need to picture the European art world at the turn of the 20th century. It was a scene dominated by rigid academies that prized realistic representation above all else. Young, rebellious artists felt stifled, desperately searching for a new visual language to express the complexities of modern life. They found their catalyst in objects arriving from Africa, often displayed not as art, but as ethnographic artifacts in colonial exhibitions and museums like the Trocadéro in Paris. Stripped of their rich cultural and spiritual context, these objects were seen by European artists purely through a formal lens. It was a flawed and incomplete perspective, yet it was this formal power that would irrevocably alter the course of Western art. Let's break down the three major formal mechanisms through which this revolution took place. First, fragmentation and the multiplicity of viewpoints. For centuries, Western art was bound by the convention of single-point perspective, creating the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface from one static viewpoint. African sculpture and mask-making traditions, however, were never confined by this rule. Consider, for example, the reliquary figures of the Fang people or the masks of the Dogon. They often present a face in both profile and front-on simultaneously. Planes are flattened, features are rearranged, and vantage points shift as you move around the object. This wasn't about creating a realistic illusion. It was about capturing the essence and spiritual power of a subject in its entirety. This conceptual approach to form resonated powerfully with artists like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. It gave them the key to unlock Cubism, allowing them to depict a subject from multiple viewpoints at once, overlapping them within a single fractured composition. They were dismantling the singular gaze and, in doing so, creating a more dynamic and complex representation of reality. The second mechanism is the simplification and abstraction of the human figure. In contrast to the European academic obsession with precise anatomical detail, many African artistic traditions reduce the body to its essential volumes, planes, and rhythms. A torso might become a simple cylinder, a head an elegant ovoid, a neck an elongated column. Look at the figurative sculptures of the Bolé or Senufo peoples. The goal is not anatomical correctness, but expressive power. The forms are distilled to convey concepts like serenity, strength, or spiritual presence. This was a profound revelation for artists like Amedeo Modigliani, whose iconic portraits with their elongated necks and mask-like faces are directly indebted to these principles. For him and others, like the German expressionist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, this approach was a license to abandon photographic realism. It allowed them to bypass mere surface appearance and instead explore the inner world of their subjects, their psychology, their feelings, their very essence. Art was no longer just about what the eye could see, but what the soul could feel. Loving this deep dive? Hit subscribe and ring the bell. Fresh art stories every week. Finally, the third mechanism, an emphasis on geometry, negative space, and rhythmic form. African art is often built upon a sophisticated foundation of geometric design. You see it in the intricate repeating patterns of Kuba textiles, the sharp angular forms of Songye power figures, and the rhythmic zigzags carved into ceremonial objects. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a structural and symbolic language. Modernists, particularly Henri Matisse, were captivated by this. They learned to use pattern and repetition, not just to adorn a surface, but to structure the entire composition, creating rhythm and movement. Furthermore, they learned to see the importance of what there. In many African sculptures, the empty space around and through the object, the negative space, is just as important as the solid form itself. It becomes an active, shape-making element. This principle taught modernists to treat the entire canvas as a unified field, where background and foreground are locked in a dynamic interplay. Through these three interconnected channels, fragmentation, abstraction, and geometric rhythm, the formal language of African art provided the vocabulary for a new kind of modern art, one that broke from the past and redefined representation itself. Research in the field supports these formal links. One study on the Africanization of the European art concludes that the cultural and political milieu in France at the turn of the century also favored the evolution of vanguards which absorbed African art. Now let's look at 2 or 3 specific case studies to ground this influence concretely. Picasso's composition shattered the salon tradition. 5 women, flat picture space, mask-like faces, angular planes. Many art historians trace the resemblance of the 2 rightmost figures to African masks. The influence of African art here didn't just decorate the work, it underpinned a radical rethinking of form and space. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. Matisse was fascinated by the color and spirituality he saw in African art, using bolder color, flattened planes, and decorative rhythms. His Fauvist period reflects a break from realism into emotional, vivid abstraction. Modigliani's elongated faces and stylized eyes owe a debt to African masks. He absorbed the power of simplification and rhythm rather than mimicry. Researchers point to African artifacts in Paris collections as an inspiration. Beyond the formal mechanics, there is a deeper philosophical shift that African art induced in modernism. To truly grasp its magnitude, we must first understand the world the modernists sought to escape. Late 19th century European art was dominated by rigid academies and official salons. Art was often a spectacle of historical allegories or flattering portraits, confined to gilded frames and pedestals, created for an elite audience. It was art as an object of aesthetic contemplation, separated from the pulse of everyday existence. Then came the encounter with objects from cultures like the Fang, the Dogon, the Bole, and the Yoruba. Here, art was not separate from life, it life. A mask was not merely a sculpture to be admired on a wall. It was a conduit for ancestral spirits, activated in the kinetic energy of a dance. A carved figure wasn't just a static form. It was a vessel for spiritual power, a participant in community rituals, a marker of social status, or a tool for healing. This was art as an active agent in the world. This fundamental difference, art as integrated function versus art as isolated decoration, was a revelation. When modernist artists like Picasso, Matisse, and the German expressionists encountered this, they began to see art not just as a mirror to the world, but as a force within it. They were inspired to break free from the purely representational. Art could be a direct conduit for emotion, a psychological exploration, a symbol of a deeper, unseen reality. It could be This shift moved the goal of art from imitation to expression, a change that defines the very essence of the modernist project. Second, this encounter forces a radical rewriting of art history itself. For centuries, the narrative was linear and self-contained, from Greece to Rome, through the Renaissance to the academies of Europe. Modernism was framed as the logical internal evolution of this Western tradition. But recognizing African art as a primary source, not just a curious footnote, shatters this clean, Eurocentric timeline. It reveals a history not of solitary genius, but of global cross-pollination. Scholars are increasingly working to de-center this old narrative, acknowledging that the story of modern art is incomplete and inaccurate without crediting its African catalysts. It's a move from a monologue to a global dialogue. Third, and most critically, the integration of African forms opened up complex and urgent debates that continue today. The fraught line between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation. The context of colonialism cannot be ignored. These objects often arrived in Europe not through equitable exchange, but as trophies of colonial conquest, displayed in ethnographic museums that reinforced notions of racial hierarchy. When modernist artists adopted these forms, they were often celebrated for their visionary genius, while the African creators remained anonymous, their cultures deemed primitive. As one paper notes, the use of African art in modernism raises ethical considerations of cultural appropriation and representation. This conversation has evolved into present-day calls for restitution and the return of looted artifacts to their communities of origin, demanding that we confront the unequal power dynamics embedded in the history of museum collections and the very canon of art. It asks a fundamental question: who has the right to tell whose story and with whose art? What does this mean for us today? First, the legacy of African art's influence on modernism offers a richer, more inclusive story of art history. It invites us to recognize art history beyond Western traditions. Second, many contemporary artists, especially in Africa and the diaspora, continue to draw from traditional African aesthetics, merging them with contemporary techniques. This influence is ongoing. For our channel, for our discourse, this means acknowledging the hidden roots of what we often call modern art, giving credit where it is due, rewriting narratives. Research also points to the broader impact of culture and environment on visual art. For example, in a large-scale quantitative study of almost 140,000 paintings, researchers found distinct transitions in visual complexity and form that correspond to shifts in artistic styles over time. So, as we've seen, the story is not that European modernism simply ran out of ideas and borrowed a few African masks. Rather, African art provided conceptual, formal, and philosophical foundations that shaped the revolutions of the early 20th century avant-garde. The next time you look at a Cubist painting, remember the abstraction of form, the flattening of space, the fragmentation of viewpoint. These weren't just Western inventions. They echo African aesthetic traditions. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share this video with someone curious about art history. And in the comments, tell us, what modernist artwork surprised you most when you learned of its African roots?